In the spirit of the kind of disruption that we're trying to create in the agenda this morning, one of the things we talked about earlier with all of the speakers this morning is their willingness to be interrupted during the course of the presentations this morning. And we're going to try to use a version of what's been the experiment that's taken place in tennis over the course of the last few years, where tennis players can challenge the umpire or challenge a line call 3 times in each set. So we're going to apply that to each of the presentations this morning. So as well as the handheld devices that Promethean have provided on your desk, and as well as the text services, the texting in of questions and so on, the links are on up here, will continue to be up here. We're also going to say, if at any stage during the course of each of the presentations between now and lunchtime, you want to ask a question, you don't understand something, you want to contest what's been said, we're going to invite each of the speakers to take 3 questions during the course of the presentation just to break it up. So if at any stage you feel like you want to intervene, put your hand up and it'll be up to the speaker to bring you in on that. Okay? All right, over to Geoff.
G'day, thanks, Steve. Okay, so I thought first off I'd just give you a quick background about who I am. I'm the founder and CEO of Etech Group. We're the makers of the learning platform StudyWiz. This is not an infotainment or an infomercial for StudyWiz, the learning platform. If you want to know more about that, we've got a booth downstairs so you can go down and check it out. But I guess to a large extent, somebody described us once as a 15-year overnight success story. So we're now currently spread across 4 continents, have staff in 20 different locations on 10 different time zones. So Skype and iChat are my best friends. I was preparing for this the other day and I just thought I'd take a snapshot. This is my typical desktop on any given day. It was interesting, the introduction of chat across our own organisation. One of the problems we faced originally, probably 4 or 5 years ago, a couple of our, shall I say, conservative accountant type administrators came to me and said, look, we're really worried about, this programmer over here because he's spending a whole lot of time on chat. What do you do? Well, now chat is such an indispensable part of our life that, yes, of course there might be 5 or 10% of the time that they're chatting with a mate, from down the road. But at the end of the day, it's all about trust. And it's all about getting on with the job and using the most appropriate tools. By the way, one of the most, I think, fantastic innovations in technology for me personally is the advent of wireless internet on planes. I'm not sure how many of you have travelled with Lufthansa or Singapore Airlines, but they've had wireless internet uplinks now for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years. And it's great being able to be flying across the Alps and giving somebody a piece of work to do. So in my job, one of the really exciting things about travelling around the world is we get to engage with a whole range of different innovative education institutions and schools from around the planet. I've just got a couple of examples here to talk about briefly. This is LaSalle College, Fine Arts College in Singapore, and that's their new campus, $60 million campus built in the middle of Sim Lim Square, and it's a real centrepiece for showcasing fine arts. And to give you a feel for it, that $60 million campus, it looks like something out of Star Trek. I'm sure there should be transporter pods to get you from one of those rooms to another. Started and was built for an initial student roll of 800 kids. That was 2 years ago. They're now at 8,000 and clamouring to keep up with the demand. So there's some really interesting use of technology there. Closer to home here, the Bridge Academy. Some of the things that we see as I travel around is different ways of, I guess, reinventing the classroom. Some of the techniques are around simply innovative use of space, and others are more about innovative use of technology. Another example, Coburg Senior High School in Victoria, Australia, rebuilt their entire college 2 years ago, and they've built it a bit like a fish tank. So all of the staff sit in the middle of the school, and there are no fixed classrooms, no walls at all, and all of the walls into the, as I call it, the fish tank, where the staff sit, are all made of glass. So the students look in on the teachers and the teachers look out on the students. And it just kind of works. They've also done some really interesting things with their curriculum as well. But one of the most interesting trends, I guess, which obviously a lot of you have been hearing about and will have seen, is the drive towards one-to-one. We have been working now for the last 2.5 years with the state of Maine, which today is still the world's largest one-to-one. The governor of the state of Maine, I don't know if anybody's ever heard Angus King, or the former governor, speak, is quite a visionary guy, and he made the decision 5-6 years ago that he wanted to give every student in his state a laptop. They're now at, I think in total there's about 140,000 laptops in distribution across the state. One of the interesting things about this is that it's completely egalitarian. So they haven't done it based on the number of students at a particular school. They have schools, I don't know how much you know about the state of Maine, but it's quite spread out. There's a lot of very small schools out on islands and all over the place, and every one of those kids in the middle schools are given a laptop no matter where they are. Okay, really interesting to be working with the guys there. Then the flip side of that is we've been working with some great schools. There's a school in former East Berlin, Rudolf Virchow Oberschule, which when I was over there, when we were first setting up StudyWiz, they were giving me a tour of the school, and they were super proud of the fact that they had a student to PC ratio of 13:1. And I have to say the PCs they were using, I think, were from 1995. And yet, they've actually been doing some really, really innovative stuff with e-learning across the school, and being one of the leaders in Berlin, and certainly in Berlin and across Germany with the use of e-learning. Then you go to the other extreme. We've got a school in Washington, DC, where they have a student laptop program at 1:2. So every student is actually bought 2 laptops. Anybody know why? Because it's deemed to be so dangerous in Washington, DC, that, and the kids all come to school wearing uniforms, that it's widely known that they would be mugged on their way home and killed for their laptops. So the school buys 2 laptops for each one of the students, one to stay at home and the other one to be at school. So again, there's from one end of the spectrum to the other quite an interesting extreme in terms of the adoption of technology in a school. Again, some of you may or may not know in Australia, the new federal government, Labor government, when they got in, made a promise of the so-called education revolution. They've promised $1 billion and access to a computer for every secondary school student across the country. So there is a real trend evolving along these lines. Personally, one of the most exciting trends that I think and what I've experienced is the new 14 to 19 agenda that's taking place here in the UK. The reason I personally think it's such a significant trend is because it actually represents a fundamental shift in the way that the traditional bricks and mortar walls of a school are being redefined. As a consequence of not having enough students left in the last years of school, rationalising that and saying, well, okay, instead of trying to offer every subject at that school, let's work in partnership with schools in the region to put together a combined curriculum, and let's physically move students from school to school. I think that this is quite interesting and could form a blueprint for the way schools work together in other parts of the world. We've been working here locally with the Kingswood Partnership down in Bristol since 2003, and we've learned a heck of a lot working together on the issues around what happens when you've got these schools working in partnership and moving kids from one school physically to another. The thing that I think is really interesting about this is, of course, if ever there's a need for a learning platform across a partnership, it's something like this with the 14 to 19 agenda. And of course, if ever there's a need to drive mobile access to that learning platform, then again, when you've got kids that are moving from school to school, there's a real screaming need to rethink the technology and how you do things with the learning platform. So we've been pioneering for the last couple of years mobile learning and the use of handheld devices and access to learning platform via these small devices. I thought what I'd do is I'll just give you there's a 3 or 4 minute video here. We've been involved in a number of different research projects. The first of these was a thing called iPodagogy, with a group of schools up in Scotland a couple of years ago, and it involved basically allowing the students to synchronise content from the learning platform directly to their iPod. We have since extended that project, and last year we ran a similar research project. The research was done formally by an independent group. It was as part of it was commissioned in part through the Victorian Department of Education, and these were some of the findings from that research.
School's out at the moment on holiday, but the results of a fascinating Victorian experiment prove that doesn't matter. Kids will learn anywhere, anytime, even maths and history. The key is an iPod and other computers. And as Jonathan Creek reports, suddenly learning is easy.
They came out with better grades.
They looked at my marks and they said I improved my tongues.
These students are at the forefront of a classroom revolution.
It's better than having to do it in a textbook.
Textbooks and chalkboards are out. The new way to learn is all about computers, iPods and digital interfaces over the internet.
You can upload lessons off of StudyWiz, put them onto iTunes and then download it onto your iPod, and then you've got the lessons.
And that could be, you could do that from anywhere in the world?
Yeah, just as long as there's a computer.
Put simply, what these devices are providing is a way for students to carry all their books, videos of their classes and even notes in their pockets at all times, which means no matter where they are, they can still be learning. And it's a model that's producing some dramatic results.
I forget things easily, but when I listen to my iPod, I get my memory back.
For the last 6 months, a grade of Year 8 students at Heathmont Secondary College has been involved in a trial to see if technology that interests them would help them learn. Assessed by the Victorian Department of Education, the report cards hold the answers.
A couple of grades, a grade or two. It's pretty good. I'm improved by 30% than I used to get, so it was way better.
Teaching is all about communication, and what the iPod is an additional way of communicating.
Maths teacher Sally Bodo was part of the iPod pilot and says it's vital that teaching methods move with technology to keep kids interested.
Some kids struggle to get their information from books. In fact, most kids, they can't just read a book and understand what the information is. Some kids struggle to focus on a lesson all the time. They sort of zone in and out, and so they miss bits in the lesson.
And it's those kids that this approach to learning targets.
Some students didn't change, some students did significantly better. They actually complained because they felt that they were overloaded, and the people who did our research for us said that they thought that that was probably because they were actually engaging in higher order thinking. So they found it more work, possibly because they had to think a bit harder.
What teachers have found is that students are actually far more engaged using this technology.
Geoff Elwood is the head of Etech Group, the Australian designers behind the StudyWiz learning platform.
It demonstrates that this new way of teaching and learning actually does increase student attention spans, does increase student output. It actually helps improve student behaviour as well, because the kids are more engaged as well. So yeah, very exciting from our standpoint.
He says this type of learning is taking off around the world and could soon be commonplace.
It was always regarded as enough to just sit the kid in front of a book, sit there and read. Well, their concentration spans are completely different now. Kids' brains nowadays are actually quite different to those of 20, 30 years ago, because of the way that students are interacting in a digital world. This kind of technology could not only replace books, but potentially could replace laptops as a form of medium for communicating with students through a classroom environment.
I used to listen to them just before I went to sleep. Yeah, so then they'd be in my brain for the morning.
It can be a very powerful addition to a teaching program.
There's no question this is the way of the future. So as you can see, it certainly got some interesting results. And the other thing you might have noticed was that particular project was carried out with the last generation of iPods. That was well before the iPod Touch. And it was really very much a one-way push, so from the learning platform down to the iPod. One of the things we're doing now, which we're very excited about, is actually these new generation of devices whether it be an iPod, an Asus EPC, any type of these new netbook devices, something with a browser. The really exciting trend is being able to interact in truly two-way dialogue with the students. So most recently, some of the stuff that we've been extending out is a lot more of our interactive elements within StudyWiz are now fully available on these small mobile devices. You know, things like being able to take a test, take a poll, set up chat rooms, RSS feeds and discussions, all directly from the device so that you can be doing this anytime, anywhere. But I guess I've got a couple of questions and a couple of observations that I want to put back to you guys as well. In terms of preparing for the future, one of the things that we've seen, which is pretty obvious, especially over the last couple of years, the only constant is change. The one consistent element for the future is change. Schools, obviously, that are prepared to embrace the change are the ones that we see as being the ones that are most successful to date. Companies like ours need to focus on evergreen technology. I'll come back to that in a second. Systems that aren't interoperable are completely useless. I think you know, some of the work that's been done with things like the Bechtel Learning Services Framework and so on, again, have been pioneering a blueprint for the rest of the world with respect to things like interoperability, being able to take an e-portfolio from one system and move it to another, being able to move from one learning platform to another so that the students aren't locked in is incredibly important. In particular, one of the things that we feel very strongly about is mobile learning will not become mainstream if it's bedded to one device. I think if you're building specific technologies for one particular device, then like we were just saying, the rapid pace of change with a lot of these devices means that it's almost impossible to keep up, you know, with the changing platforms. So the real challenge is trying to come up with technologies that can work across any number of these different devices. And so a couple of questions for you guys. This is, I guess, more in relation to particularly some of the unfolding partnerships, things around 14 to 19, or when you're working in clusters of schools. When purchasing content, have you thought about access rights, licensing, copyright, and ownership rights across institutions and across the devices? I'm not saying I have the answer. This is really for you guys to think about. Be keen to hear some feedback on that. So it's relatively straightforward to say, okay, I've purchased some content for my school. Well, what happens when your school or when your diploma that you're doing spans 6 or 7 different institutions, for example, and where do the boundaries lie? You know, where do I have access to that content? Am I allowed to take it home on my iPod? Am I allowed to use it from home? And so on. The other question is, and this has always intrigued me, you know, why are some schools able to succeed with successful e-learning despite ratios of 13 to 1, and yet others that have much higher student to PC ratio, PC to student ratios sometimes struggle? This is a biggie. Are schools prepared to actively encourage students to access mobile devices in class? In fact, I think, Steve, I'm not sure what the story is with votes on this, but I'd love to see a snap poll, you know, of the people in the audience. So, will you let students use a mobile device in your class? Yep. Yes or no?
Yes.
Interesting.
No.
So there's a whole lot of don't knows, I take that. Cool, very interesting. And I guess the other one, this is more an out there kind of question. With a lot of the new devices, particularly things like the new iPhones and the iPod Touches, what kind of uses for location services can you see coming in the next generation of software? Have you even thought about it? What happens when students can actually respond and say, yes, I'm in school, press this button, for example?
I'm sure, because I can see eagerness out there. Do you want to pick up?
Yep.
It's on its way.
Is that working?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nick Kind from Spark Learning. We spend a lot of time developing content for publishers and broadcasters. was just going to respond to question 1. I think the key there is, just on the first point, the U is actually not only the schools and institutions and consortia, but also the publishers. And in my experience of having done this for quite a while now, the key to getting that right is to make it as simple and understandable as possible. There are lots and lots and lots of models all over the world, and there have been for several years, particularly in the higher education community, about licensing content in that kind of more open way. The easiest and most user-friendly thing to do is to actually be very open about it, but that makes publishers twitch really badly.
Creative Commons.
Well, no, not necessarily Creative Commons, but just if you're licensing some content, if you own some IP, saying, I understand that this is going to go into all of those places. I have priced that in, and I know the risks that are involved. Because without being relatively open about it, institutions get very paranoid about impinging on those rights, and the content doesn't get used. If you're more open about it, more people use it, and hopefully people resubscribe.
Yeah, good point. Is there a question down the back?
Question in the back.
G'day, it's Jo Jacobs here from, I actually am Australian, but I'm based here in London. I want to answer question 2, which is why schools are able to succeed. Frankly, technology and access to technology has absolutely no relation whatsoever to learning outcomes. And I think this is an obsession that we all have, whether somebody has access to the technologies or whether we're using the wrong particular pedagogy if we're saying that these people won't have access to mobile phones. Really, we should be looking at learning outcomes and working out how students can access these technologies and utilise the technologies to create their own learning spaces. I'm slightly depressed by the whole notion of our focus being on access to technologies and on access to platforms, and not on what the experience of engaging with those technologies results in terms of learning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The other point that that I'd be keen to make on that front is, from our experience, we've seen massive ranges in take-up in technology. You know, we actually actively monitor, for example, usage patterns with our own software, so we can see are people using it or not, simply because we don't want to be in the business of building a white elephant. You know, there's no point putting something out there if people don't use it. And we've learnt a huge amount, particularly over the last couple of years, and indeed this year, with working with some of the local authorities. And one of the keys that we're seeing that makes a huge difference is this whole concept of success management. You know, leadership training. Mike and others can talk more about this in detail afterwards, but I think that having the whole vision, I mean, the state of Maine is a good example as well. People get hung up on the fact that it's a one-to-one. And across the US, if you've been reading any of the press, there have been numerous different one-to-one programs out there in the States for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And they've been widely lambasted in the press as abject failures, because they haven't been seen to be increasing student results or anything. And I think that was really why I posed the question in the first place, to be a little bit controversial, but also to really think about, well, it has to be an holistic approach. You know, leadership training, it's not just about PD, but of course PD is one of the real keys to it as well, and looking at the issues. So certainly I agree from the engaging the student standpoint, but from our own experience, one of the major issues to get across is the whole PD take-up training of teachers, so that they're familiar and okay with the technology. How are we going for time, Steve?
Look at R5. Look at R5, Geoff. Any more questions at all? There we go. Here, 2 more, and then just one over here.
Tony Booth from the Kingsford Partnership. I'd just like to say something about question 1, which I think is a very interesting one. And also the observation yesterday afternoon when Stephen Happel was talking about the need for the education community to move from an emphasis perhaps on projects towards more strategic goals in the way they introduce and deploy e-learning approaches. Now, I have a view that the industry itself should help with this question. If we move into a 14 to 19 world where youngsters aren't commonly located in single schools anymore, and where you've got much more of a collegiate basis operating to provide management across a consortia of schools, then that's going to become a big question. I mean, how do schools maintain a sovereignty over their own direction and yet become part of a larger partnership world? It does seem to me that schools have enough to worry about taking on such changes without the worry of dealing with or worrying over licensing and access rights, and that perhaps the industry itself ought to be helping us quite a lot more with that. Perhaps it would be some kind of repository model, sufficiently sophisticated to allow the right levels of access to the different participating schools. So I think what I'm saying is the technology ought to enhance, not get in the way of the progress that we need to make on this one.
Yeah, good point.
Over here. Geoff, yeah.
2 and 4. I think probably my best practice in the classroom was when I had a Westrex teletype on a 75 baud modem in a broom cupboard. It's what I did with it that was the important thing, not how many I had. 4, I think that some of the early days of what we call mLearning have been about the ability to have learning anywhere, that it's learning on the go, learning wherever you are, whatever you're doing. I think what location gives us the potential for is actually learning somewhere, where the context of the place that you're actually in matters to what you're learning. And so that I've been involved in projects which have really made use of location, and I think it is context is all in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's really cool.
Okay, do you want to take any of those questions? Any final questions for Geoff? He's come a long way, so.
Stuart Smith from the University of Manchester. With regards to the content issue, I've worked in the schools, tertiary and HE sector with regards to delivering mobile and digital content. And it's a complicated issue, and just with regards to the comment that was made previously about the industry getting involved, I do think it's time that UK, EU and internationally there is a review of how we manage educational IPR, and we need to find the right model, because digital rights management, etc., these things can be relatively easily broken and are frequently broken. The number of iTunes updates that happen each day
yeah, exactly.
Are confusing. And I don't think the current attitude that we have towards IPR and education is working. This is all new. The industry, mobile industry is still young, the web industry is still young, and the convergence of the technologies is very, very new. And it's not just a technology, but it's a social attitude and legal attitude that needs to change. I wish I had the answer, because I'd be making lots of money, hopefully, doing that. But I do think it's time that we opened up the debate and we had a really broad, honest debate about asking what value IPR really has, particularly in the educational context.
Yeah, I think that's why I posed the question in the first place, because I think in the past it's been about, as the point was made, about access to technology and about what the technology can do. And really one of the questions now is, okay, assuming that the technology is relatively ubiquitous and across multiple devices, then we need to start thinking about, well, what are the ownership rights? You know, in our own experience, teachers are the best magpies on the planet when it comes to collecting content and putting things together, if they've got time and the chance to do so. But in many cases, what are the issues around infringement of copyright, for example? Again, I don't claim to have an answer either. It's just I think it's something that needs to be discussed in a more broader context. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks very much for your time, guys. And if you've got any questions or you want to follow up with anything, then there's my email address. Feel free to grab us when we're downstairs later.